The test kit sat on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks before I finally opened it. It was just a small plastic tube and a piece of cotton, but to me it felt like a ticking bomb. My whole life I've been told that I was the mistake, the broken link in an otherwise perfect family chain. My mother used to say it whenever she got tired of looking at me or whenever my brother Julian did something worth celebrating. "You're just a burden, Leo," she'd mutter, not even looking up from her coffee. "We do so much for you and we get nothing back." I believed her. For 26 years, I genuinely believed I was the problem, the financial drain, the kid who just took up too much space and air. But as I finally scraped the inside of my cheek and sealed that little plastic tube, I had no idea that the lie wasn't me. The lie was everything I had ever been told about who I was, where I came from, and why they hated me so much. It was a Tuesday evening when everything started to completely fracture. We were sitting around the dining table at my mother's house. It was always the same setup. Julian sat to her right, his wife Maya next to him, and I was stuck at the far end, near the kitchen door that kept swinging shut and hitting my chair. They were talking about Julian's new business venture. He wanted to buy into a franchise downtown, and he needed a massive cash injection. "We're just a little short on the initial deposit," Julian said, swirling his wine glass like he was some kind of high-powered executive. He didn't even look at me when he spoke. He always talked past me, like I was a ghost occupying a seat. My mother, Eleanor, sighed heavily and set her fork down. The sound of metal hitting the porcelain plate was incredibly loud in the sudden silence. She looked directly at me, her eyes cold, narrowed, and filled with that familiar, heavy disappointment. "Leo needs to sign over his portion of the house, the deed your grandfather left. It's just sitting there, doing nothing. Julian can actually build a future with that money. You're just renting that tiny apartment, Leo. You don't have a real career. It's time you finally contributed something to this family instead of just dragging us down." I felt the food turn to ash in my mouth. The grandfather they were talking about was Arthur, my dad's father, who had passed away 5 years ago. He was the only person in that entire house who ever looked at me like I mattered. When he died, he left a small specific clause giving me a 1/3 share of the family property. "Mom, I live in that apartment because it's all I can afford on my salary," I said, my voice shaking a little. I hated how small I sounded around them. "And that share, grandfather gave it to me for a reason. He wanted me to have a safety net." "A safety net for what, Leo?" Julian laughed, a short, mocking sound that made my stomach twist. "It's not spite," I whispered, looking down at my hands. They were trembling, so I hid them beneath the table, gripping my knees. "Enough, Leo," Eleanor cut in, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "We've supported you, put up with your failures, and carried your weight for your entire life. You've been a financial and emotional burden since the day you were born. The least you can do now is let your brother succeed. Sign the papers tomorrow, or don't bother coming back here." Nobody said anything else. Maya kept chewing her food, staring at her phone. Julian smiled slightly, taking another sip of his wine. The silence in the room was suffocating. I didn't finish my dinner. I stood up, gripped the back of my chair until my knuckles turned white, and walked out into the cold night air, the sound of the front door clicking shut, feeling like a final sentence. Growing up in that house was like living in a theater where everyone else had the script except me. I remember being 8 years old, sitting on the faded green carpet in the living room, watching Julian open presents on his birthday. He got a brand new mountain bike, a computer, and clothes that actually fit him. When my birthday came around 3 months later, Eleanor gave me a box of Julian's old sweaters and a generic notebook. "Be grateful," she told me when she saw the look on my face. "Money doesn't grow on trees, Leo. We have to prioritize the child who actually shows promise." I used to go to bed wondering what I had done wrong. Did I breathe too loudly? Did I ask for too much food? I tried so hard to be perfect. I got straight A's in middle school. I brought home report cards thinking, this is it. This is the day she smiles at me. but Eleanor would barely glance at the paper. She'd put it on the counter right next to Julian's C- report card and say, "Well, book smarts don't mean much if you don't have personality, Leo. Look at your brother. He's a leader. People actually like him." My dad, Robert, was always a shadow in that house. He was a quiet, tired man who worked long hours at a local accounting firm. He never looked me in the eye. When Eleanor would berate me at the dinner table, he would just stare intently at his plate, cutting his meat into tiny, perfectly square pieces. He never defended me, not once. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear them arguing in their bedroom. "He doesn't belong here, Robert." Eleanor's voice would drift through the thin drywall, sharp and venomous. "Look at him. He doesn't look like you. He doesn't act like you. He's just a constant reminder of everything that went wrong." "Just leave it, Eleanor," my dad would mumble, his voice sounding exhausted, defeated. "He's just a kid." "He's a burden," she'd fire back. And then the house would go completely quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. The only sanctuary I had was Grandfather Arthur's house. He lived about 3 miles away in a small, weathered bungalow that smelled like old books, pipe tobacco, and peppermint candies. He was my dad's father, but he treated my dad with a strange, distant formality. With me, though, he was different. He'd let me sit in his study while he repaired old clocks. The rhythmic tick, tick, tick of those clocks was the only time my mind ever felt peaceful. "You've got steady hands, Leo," Arthur told me one rainy Saturday afternoon when I was 12. He handed me a tiny brass gear. "A man with steady hands and a quiet mind can survive anything. Don't let them make you feel small, you hear me?" "Why does Mom hate me?" I asked him, the question slipping out before I could stop it. I remember the exact smell of the rain hitting the window pane, the damp earth outside. Arthur stopped working. He set his magnifying loupe down on the desk and looked at me for a long time. His eyes were incredibly sad, full of a deep, ancient regret that a 12-year-old could possibly understand. He reached out and placed a rough, calloused hand on my shoulder. "It's not about you, Leo," he said softly, his voice cracking slightly. "It was never about you. There are things in this family that are twisted up like old roots. You just keep your head down, study hard, and get your independence. That's your ticket out." He died when I was 21, right in the middle of my college years I had to pay for entirely on my own through student loans and working graveyard shifts at a local diner, while Eleanor and Robert fully funded Julian's business degree at a private university. When Arthur passed, his will was a shock to everyone. He left his house and savings to be split evenly between Julian, my dad, and me. Eleanor was furious. She spent weeks trying to find a lawyer to contest the will, claiming Arthur wasn't in his right mind, but the legal documents were airtight. That 1/3 share was the only tangible proof I had that I actually existed to someone in that family. After that terrible dinner, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my cramped apartment, listening to the traffic outside my window. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. My mind kept looping back to Eleanor's words, "You've been a financial and emotional burden since the day you were born." Why? What was the root of it? It wasn't just standard favoritism. It felt deeper, like a visceral, physical rejection. I started thinking about the physical differences that had always been an unsaid joke in the family. Julian looked exactly like Robert, tall, broad-shouldered, with thick black hair and sharp blue eyes. I was short, thin, with auburn hair and green eyes. Growing up, people at church would often comment on it. "Are you sure this one belongs to you, Eleanor?" they'd laugh. Eleanor would always tighten her grip on my arm until it bruised and reply, "Unfortunately, yes, every family has its odd duck." The next day at work, I couldn't focus. My eyes were burning from lack of sleep. Around 2 p.m., my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from my dad. He almost never texted me. "Leo, please just sign the paperwork for your brother. Your mother hasn't slept all night. She's making herself sick over this. Don't cause trouble for once." I stared at the screen. Don't cause trouble for once. I hadn't caused trouble a single day in my life. I had shrunk myself down to nothing just to keep the peace. I didn't reply. 5 minutes later, another text arrived, this time from Julian. It was a photo of a legal document, a quitclaim deed, already filled out with my name. The notary is down the street from your office, I checked. Go there during your lunch break tomorrow. Let's get this over with so we can move on. Mom's blood pressure is through the roof. They weren't asking, they were demanding. The emotional manipulation was so casual, so practiced. It was the same tactic they used when I was 18, and they forced me to hand over the money I had saved from my summer job to help pay for Julian's spring break trip to Mexico. Julian needs the social networking, Eleanor had told me then. You don't even have friends, Leo. Why do you need a savings account? I went to the bathroom at work, locked myself in a stall, and sank down against the cold tile wall. I felt a profound sense of isolation. I had no one to turn to. Arthur was gone. My parents saw me as a transaction, a line item they wanted to delete from their ledger. That evening, I was mindlessly scrolling through social media when I saw an ad for an Ancestry DNA testing kit. It promised to map your heritage and connect you with distant relatives. I don't know why, but a strange, icy feeling gripped my chest. It was like a sudden, intuitive click in my brain. The arguments late at night when I was a kid, my dad's complete refusal to look at me, Eleanor's utter disgust whenever I entered a room, Arthur's sad, cryptic warning about twisted roots. I ordered the kit right then and there. It cost me $80, money I really should have saved for groceries, but I didn't care. I needed something. I needed a distraction, or maybe, deep down in a place I was too terrified to admit, I needed an answer. The 3 weeks it took for the kit to arrive and the subsequent weeks waiting for the lab results were a living hell. The pressure from my family escalated from passive-aggressive texts to outright harassment. One evening, I came home to find Julian sitting on the steps of my apartment building. He had a manila envelope in his hand. The streetlights were just flickering on, casting long, menacing shadows across the concrete. "You're avoiding Mom's calls," Julian said, standing up as I approached. He blocked the entrance to the doorway. "I've been busy with work, Julian," I said, keeping my distance. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "We're running out of time on the franchise option. The sellers have another offer. If we lose this because you're throwing a tantrum, Leo, I swear to God, you are completely dead to this family. Mom will disown you legally. You won't get a single dime when she passes. Nothing." "She already treats me like I'm disowned," I said, a sudden spark of anger cutting through my usual fear. "Why do you guys think you have the right to just take what grandfather left me? He wanted it for me." Julian stepped closer, his chest nearly touching mine. He smelled like expensive cologne and leather. "Because you didn't earn it. You never earned anything. You're a leech. You've lived off our parents' charity your whole life, and now you're trying to ruin my future out of pure envy. Sign the fucking papers." He shoved the envelope against my chest. I didn't take it, so it dropped to the dirty concrete floor between us. Julian stared at it, then looked up at me, his eyes full of pure contempt. He kicked the envelope toward my shoes. "Tomorrow night," he said. "It's Mom's 50th birthday dinner at the Riverside restaurant. Everyone is going to be there. Aunt Sarah, Uncle David, everyone. You will bring that signed document to the dinner, hand it to Mom, and apologize for being an ungrateful little shit. If you don't, I will personally ensure you never set foot in our house again." He turned around and walked away, getting into his clean, late-model sedan and speeding off into the dark. I picked up the envelope. The corners were damp from the puddles on the ground. I went upstairs, locked my door with both locks, and threw the envelope on the kitchen table next to my computer. I sat down and opened my email. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely track the mouse cursor. There was a notification in my inbox from the DNA testing company. Your results are ready. My mouth went completely dry. The silence in my apartment was deafening, broken only by the steady, metallic drip of the kitchen faucet. I clicked the link. I logged into the secure portal. The screen loaded slowly, a spinning circle of dots that seemed to take an eternity. Finally, the dashboard appeared. I bypassed the ethnicity breakdown and clicked directly on the tab labeled DNA Relatives. I expected to see a long list of distant cousins with the last name Miller, my dad's family name. I expected to see some connection to Eleanor's side, the Johnsons. Instead, the top match, a 49.8% genetic match listed as parent, was a name I had never heard of in my entire life: Thomas Vance. Beneath it, there were no Millers, no Johnsons. There were dozens of relatives with the last names Vance, Reynolds, and Clark. I scrolled down, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I looked at the shared DNA percentage for my father, Robert Miller. He wasn't on the list. I had uploaded my raw data to a public database a few days prior, just in case, and there was absolutely zero genetic connection to the man who had raised me. I just sat there staring at the wall for a minute. I didn't even know what to think. The room felt like it was tilting, the cheap IKEA desk beneath my elbows suddenly feeling unstable. Robert Miller wasn't my father. The revelation didn't hit me all at once. It rolled over me in a slow, freezing wave. I wasn't a Miller. The reason Eleanor looked at me with such venom, the reason Robert couldn't bear to look me in the eye, the reason Julian treated me like an invasive species, it wasn't because I was inherently broken. It was because I was living proof of a secret they had spent 26 years trying to bury. I spent the entire night buried in front of my computer screen, the cold coffee on my desk completely forgotten. I looked up the name Thomas Vance. It didn't take long to find him. He lived in a small town about 2 hours north of us. He was a contractor, 52 years old, with a weathered, kind face in his profile picture. He had green eyes, my green eyes. He had the same slight, crooked smile that I saw in the mirror every single morning. But I needed more than just a name on a screen. I needed context. I remembered an old, heavy wooden trunk that sat in Grandfather Arthur's attic. When he died, the house had been locked up, waiting for the three-way split or sale. I still had the key Arthur had given me years ago, a heavy brass key he kept on a leather fob. At 3 a.m., driven by an adrenaline rush I couldn't control, I drove over to Arthur's old house. The neighborhood was dead silent. The house looked dark and abandoned, the lawn overgrown with weeds. I unlocked the back door, the hinges groaning loudly in the quiet night. The familiar smell of old books and peppermint hit me, but now it was masked by dust and dampness. I went upstairs to the attic, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I found the wooden trunk under a tarp. My hands were freezing as I fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. Inside were Arthur's personal journals, old war medals, and bundles of letters tied with kitchen twine. I searched through the bundles until I found one labeled Robert and Eleanor, 1999. That was the year I was born. I sat on the dusty attic floor, my back against a wooden beam, and began to read Arthur's steady cursive handwriting in his personal diary from that year. May 14th, 1999. Robert came to the house tonight in a terrible state. Eleanor has been seeing that contractor, Vance, while Robert was away on the audit trip. She's pregnant. Robert wants a divorce, but Eleanor is threatening to take everything, including the house. She wants to pretend the child is Robert's to save face with her family and keep the marital assets. Robert is weak. He's going to agree to it just to avoid the scandal. I told him he's making a deal with the devil. That poor child will pay the price for Eleanor's sins." A tear dropped onto the old yellowed page, smudging the blue ink. That poor child will pay the price. Arthur knew. He had known the entire time. He didn't leave me that 1/3 share out of random charity. He left it to me because he knew I was an innocent bystander in a war of pride and deceit. He wanted to make sure that when the truth eventually came out, I had some leverage, some protection against the woman who had spent my life punishing me for the crime of existing. The next 48 hours were a blur of absolute emotional exhaustion. I didn't go to work on Thursday. I called in sick, my voice sounding so hollow and dead that my supervisor didn't even ask questions. I just sat in my apartment staring at the manila envelope Julian had left on my floor, and then at the printouts of the DNA results and Arthur's diary entries. The birthday dinner was scheduled for Friday night at 7 p.m. The countdown felt like a tightening noose. Eleanor kept calling me. My phone would buzz on the kitchen counter, sliding an inch each time against the wood. Mom calling. I didn't answer. Then a text from Robert. "Leo, don't ruin this night for your mother. Bring the signed deed." They were so confident. They thought they had broken me down over 26 years to the point where I would just accept my role as the family sacrifice. They needed my share of the house to fund Julian's life, and they expected me to hand it over with an apology for being a burden. On Friday afternoon, I made a phone call. It wasn't to a lawyer, and it wasn't to my parents. I called Thomas Vance. The phone rang 4 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Hello, Thomas speaking." My throat completely closed up. I couldn't breathe. The silence stretched between us for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. "Hello?" the voice said again, sounding confused but not unkind. "Is someone there?" "Thomas?" I finally managed to croak out, my voice barely a whisper. "My name is Leo Miller. Well, that's my legal name. I just got my DNA results back from the Ancestry Registry." There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The casual background noise of what sounded like a workshop, the hum of a saw or a radio, suddenly stopped. "Leo?" Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming incredibly thick with emotion. "Oh my God, Eleanor's boy." "You knew about me?" I asked, a tear spilling over my eyelashes and running down my cheek. "I suspected," Thomas whispered. "Eleanor, she cut me off completely the moment she found out she was pregnant. She told me if I ever came near her or her family, she'd tell the police I assaulted her. She had money, her family had status in the town, and I was just a 26-year-old kid starting a business. I wanted to reach out so many times, Leo, especially when I heard how things were in that house. A friend of a friend told me things, but I was terrified of destroying your life completely." "They hate me, Thomas," I said, the raw truth coming out of me before I could filter it. "They've spent my whole life telling me I'm a burden." "You are not a burden," Thomas said, and I could hear him crying through the phone line. It was the first time in my entire life a man's voice sounded warm and protective directed at me. "Listen to me. Do you need me to come down there? I can be there in 2 hours." "No," I said, wiping my face with the sleeve of my shirt. A strange, calm certainty suddenly rooted in my chest, the steady hands my grandfather talked about. "No, don't come yet. There's something I have to finish tonight. But can I call you tomorrow?" "Any time, Leo, day or night. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." When I hung up the phone, the fear that had dictated my entire existence was completely gone. It was replaced with a cold, hard clarity. I picked up the manila envelope from the table. I didn't sign the quitclaim deed.
Instead, I tucked the DNA report and a photocopied page of Grandfather Arthur's 1999 diary entry inside it.
The Riverside restaurant was the kind of place that required a jacket and served portions too small for the price. When I arrived at 7:15 p.m., the hostess led me to a private dining room in the back. The door was heavy oak, muffling the laughter inside until she pushed it open. The whole family was there. Eleanor was at the head of the long table, wearing a bright red dress and a pearl necklace. Robert sat to her left, looking small and gray. Julian and Maya were across from them, alongside Aunt Sarah and Uncle David, who were chatting loudly about their recent vacation. As I walked in, the laughter died down. Eleanor's face instantly hardened. She looked at my casual jacket and my worn jeans with immediate disgust. "You're late, Leo," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "and you didn't even bother to dress appropriately for my 51st birthday." "Sorry," I said flatly, walking up to the table. I didn't take an empty seat. I just stood at the foot of the table, looking at all of them. Julian leaned forward, smirking. "Did you bring the gift, Leo, the one we talked about?" Every eye at the table turned to me. Aunt Sarah looked uncomfortable, sensing the thick tension in the room. Robert looked away, staring intently at his water glass. "Leo," Robert mumbled, his voice cracking, Can we not do this right now, please? This is your mother's birthday." "My mother?" I said, my voice completely calm, echoing clearly in the small private room. "That's funny, Robert, because according to this legal document, you aren't my father. And according to Grandfather Arthur's diary, which is also in that envelope, Eleanor spent 26 years punishing me because I look like the man she actually loved, the man she cheated on you with." Aunt Sarah gasped, dropping her fork onto her plate with a loud clack. Uncle David sat frozen, his mouth half open. "Leo, stop it!" Eleanor suddenly screamed, slamming her hands down on the table, knocking over her wine glass. The red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, soaking into the edges of the DNA report like blood. "You are an ungrateful, malicious little monster. How dare you bring these lies into my dinner? How dare you to try and ruin this family?" "I didn't ruin this family, Eleanor," I said, using her first name for the first time in my life. It felt incredibly strange, like casting off a heavy chain. "You ruined it 26 years ago. You brought me into a house where I was hated for a secret you created. You let Julian treat me like garbage. You let Robert ignore me. You called me a burden every single day of my life, when the only real burden in this family was your hypocrisy." Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked frantic, his face turning a dark, angry purple. "This is bullshit. This is a fake test. You made this up because you're a selfish piece of shit who doesn't want to help me with the franchise. Dad, tell him. Tell him he's lying." Robert didn't say a word. He shrank back into his chair, looking smaller than he ever had before. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. He was crying, silently, out of pure humiliation. "He's not lying, Julian," I said, looking directly at my brother. "Look at Dad. He's known the whole time. Grandfather Arthur knew too. That's why he left me that share of the house. He knew you guys would try to starve me out the moment he died." Julian looked at Robert, then at Eleanor, who was staring at the spilled red wine on the table with blank, terrified eyes. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow. The absolute certainty he'd lived with his entire life, that he was the golden child, the rightful heir, the superior brother, was crumbling right in front of him. Without my share of the property, his franchise deal was completely dead. The bank wouldn't approve the loan without that specific collateral. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, leaning over the table, placing my hands flat on the wood, the steady hands. "I am not signing that quitclaim deed. In fact, on Monday morning, my lawyer is filing a petition to force the sale of Grandfather's house. You have 60 days to buy out my 1/3 share at current market value, or the court will auction the property off to the highest bidder." "You can't do that,"
Eleanor whispered, her voice completely devoid of its usual power. It sounded like a dry leaf scraping across concrete. "That house has been in the family for 3 generations." "It's not my family," I said softly. "You made sure of that. You have 60 days to find the cash to pay me out, Eleanor. If Julian loses his franchise because of it, well, I guess he'll just have to learn what it feels like to be a financial burden." I looked around the table one last time. Aunt Sarah was staring at the floor. Julian looked like he wanted to jump over the table and hit me, but he was completely paralyzed by the social ruin of having his aunt and uncle witness the entire ugly truth. Maya was aggressively typing on her phone, likely already planning her exit from the drama. I turned around and walked out of the private room. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying since I was 8 years old. The fallout from that night was massive and messy, exactly like real life always is. There were no tidy closures or sudden apologies. Eleanor tried to call me dozens of times over the next week, alternating between leaving screaming, unhinged voicemails calling me a traitor and sending sobbing texts begging me not to force the sale of the house. I blocked her number permanently by Wednesday. Julian's franchise deal collapsed entirely 3 days later. Without my signature on the deed, the sellers pulled out and went with their backup offer. Julian's wife, Maya, moved out of their apartment and went to stay with her parents 2 weeks later. Apparently, their marriage couldn't handle the sudden loss of financial security and the total destruction of Julian's successful businessman facade. Julian ended up having to take a low-paying job at a local car dealership just to make his car payments. He sent me one final email full of pure, unadulterated hatred, blaming me for destroying his life. I deleted it without replying. Robert reached out to me once, about a month after the dinner. He asked to meet me at a quiet diner on the edge of town. I went, mostly out of curiosity. We sat in a vinyl booth for 45 minutes. He looked incredibly old, his hands shaking as he poured sugar into his black coffee. The diner smelled like old grease and floor cleaner. "I'm sorry, Leo," he said, not looking at me. He was staring at the neon sign in the window. "I should have stood up for you, but every time I looked at you, I just saw Thomas. I saw her betrayal. It wasn't fair to you. I know that now." "It wasn't fair, Robert," I said, keeping my voice level. "I was just a kid. I didn't choose to be born." "I know," he whispered. We didn't have a grand emotional reconciliation. There was too much scar tissue, too many years of silence and cold shoulders. He paid for the coffee, we shook hands awkwardly in the parking lot, and we went our separate ways. I haven't spoken to him since. The forced sale of Grandfather Arthur's house went through 3 months later. Eleanor couldn't raise the capital to buy out my share, so the property was sold to a local developer. After the legal fees were deducted, I received a check for $94,000. It wasn't a $1 million lottery win, but to me, it was complete and total freedom. It paid off all my student loans entirely and left me with a healthy savings cushion.
The most incredible part of this entire journey wasn't the money and it wasn't the revenge. It was Thomas. About a month after the confrontation at the restaurant, I drove up north to meet him. He lived in a small, cedar-shingled house surrounded by pine trees. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, he was already standing on the porch, waiting for me. We didn't have an awkward silence. He walked right down the steps and pulled me into a hug that felt so genuine it made my chest ache. He didn't treat me like a burden. He treated me like a long-lost piece of his own life. Over the last year, we've been slowly building a real relationship. I go up there every other weekend. He's teaching me how to work with wood, how to use a lathe, how to build things with my hands, the steady hands. Turns out he has the exact same calm, quiet demeanor that Grandfather Arthur had. Sometimes we just sit on his porch in the evening, drinking beer and watching the fireflies in the yard. It's quiet. An uncomfortable, heavy silence used to terrify me in my mother's house because it usually meant an emotional storm was coming.
But here, with Thomas, the silence is just peace. It's just two people existing in the same space without any hidden agendas or expectations. I still go to therapy once a week to process the 26 years of emotional abuse. You don't just get over being told you're a burden overnight just because a DNA test changed the narrative. But now, when those old voices creep into my head late at night, telling me I'm not enough or that I'm taking up too much space, I look at the small wooden clock Thomas helped me build. I listen to its steady tick, tick, tick on my nightstand, and I remind myself that the lie is over. I am home. It takes a lot of courage to look into the dark corners of your own life and demand the truth, especially when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones holding the flashlights. Have you ever experienced a moment where a single piece of hidden information completely changed how you looked at your entire family or your own life? How did you find the strength to walk away from people who treated you like a burden instead of a human being? Let's talk about it in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your stories.